Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined in this episode by Richard Kadrey, author of the long-running urban fantasy series Sandman Slim. These novels follow the paranormal misadventures of James Stark, a hard-to-kill, half-human magician who spent 11 years stuck in hell as an arena gladiator and pet hitman for his demon masters. After carving a bloody path back to Earth, Stark reemerges in Los Angeles, hell-bent on killing the circle of humans who sent him to suffer downtown. But to live and avenge in LA requires grit, gear, and allies, plus the occasional occult oddjob to keep you in Kevlar. When your companions are carnivorous spider people, fallen angels, and disembodied talking heads, and your enemies are kill-happy sorcerers, undead legions, and hellion lords, well, you're gonna need a grim sense of humor, a fistful of supernatural powers, and an eagerness to get way down and very dirty. For better or probably worse, Stark has a triple helping of all of that, which is how he earned his nickname, Sandman Slim, the monster who kills monsters. 10 high-octane novels in the Sandman Slim series are available now, and the 11th, Ballistic Kiss, is also out now from Harper Voyager. And Richard, welcome to Fictitious.
Thank you very much for having me. Great to be here.
So it is a difficult thing enough to describe one novel succinctly. When you have 10 or 11, it's a whole other matter.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that people who are listening to this episode are, some of whom will be fans of your work long term and will want to know the craft that goes into running a long-term series like this. But I also hope there will be a ton of new people who will be hearing about your stuff for the first time and getting introduced to this world. And I want to say, I think for all the difficulty of what's going on, in the world in the age of COVID and pandemic, for me, this was the right time to discover Sandman Slim, because I feel like this is great escapist, fun, urban fantasy, because I feel like a lot of super heavy books have landed, in my lap, and I have not had the mental bandwidth and emotional bandwidth to handle those. So this was a really, really welcome departure. I got wordy with my description of it. How do you explain this series to people?
God, I thought you were great. You really hit all the high and low points of it, as far as I'm concerned. The only thing I'd add is that over the course of all these books, what I'm trying to write is the rehabilitation of a monster. That in Sandman Slim, when Stark first comes back from hell, he is clinically insane. He has spent 11 years being abused by monsters. He is the first human being to be in hell while alive. And the creatures down there had a lot of fun with him. So when he escapes and comes back to Earth, he's not just looking for vengeance on the group who sent him down to hell. He's looking for vengeance on the world, on heaven, on God, everything and everyone who he felt abandoned him. So when he comes back, he's quite happy to contemplate destroying the entire human race. And over the course of the series, what I'm trying to do is have him become more involved with the human race. He resists friendship. He resists love. He resists any human connections for the first few books. But he is a human being. And when he comes back to Earth, he cannot help but make connections. And at different times, he thinks connections make him weak. At different times, he thinks connections make him strong. And that's one of his conflicts throughout the entire series. But what I'm trying to do is to show the growth and the difference of a monster over a certain length of time. And can you bring someone back from as miserable and desperate and awful a place as James Stark was when he woke up in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery on a pile of burning garbage 2 or 3 years ago?
I like that you mentioned that, because it's definitely something I want to talk about with this, which is that when you take a character over a long stretch, every story is, for the most part, about character development. There are some, classic characters that don't change much, and so you have to sort of surround them with other characters who do, say like a Judge Dredd or something like that. But to have a character over a long run like this, you really have to find every time new things to explore with them, both within the confines of an individual novel, but then over a long arc. What has kept you coming back to the series? Having a long running series, like discovering new character development, new places to go, new things to explore. I mean, that can be challenging over a trilogy, let alone 11 novels. So what has kept you coming back to this character, and what new aspects do you keep finding?
Well, one of the things I want to look at is not just the action and, for all the highfalutin stuff I'm trying to talk about, there's a lot of drinking and punching and smoking and smiting of enemies. But I'm also concerned about the consequences of all those actions. If you run around killing people all the time who are granted to be bad people, there are consequences from that, both in terms of your psyche and the world. So dealing both with Stark's consequences and the consequences of the celestial sphere. I paint God in a very flawed light because I think, having grown up with the Bible and the church and all that, I think that all that religious paraphernalia that we grew up with is very flawed and very confusing. And I think if you accept the idea of the Christian deity, he's a mess. He's a complete mess. And I like to explore that too. So it's about Stark, but it's also about the nature of humanity. It's about the nature of God, the devil, hell, heaven, and earth. So there's a lot to play with there. And I'm quite happy to keep coming back to it because also the way this series is set up, I have arcs all the way through. The first 6 books are an arc, and I'm doing a second 6 books that also are an arc. So structurally, I understand how the story is going to flow and how Stark is going to react to the world around him.
When you set out to write the first one, I think Sandman Slim, the first novel, I think was published in like 2009. Does that sound right?
I have no idea at this point. Sure, let's say 2009.
Yeah. Which makes me guess that like probably you started drafting in earnest maybe 2007 or 2008. So I'm, kind of guessing, around where this would have come from. Were you always thinking long-term series, long run? Was that how you pitched it whenever you were approaching publishers? Where did this idea come from, and how much were you envisioning that longevity to begin with?
Well, originally, I wanted to write a series, and the pitch was a series. So I came at it. I was very mercenary. I'll admit that right now. I had written several books by then, none of which had done a damn thing. And I came at Sandman Slim with the idea that if this book doesn't sell for more than a paltry sum of money, I was going to quit. Sandman Slim was my last shot at writing books because I was broke and I was exhausted by writing novels and I was getting nowhere. So I wrote 100 pages of Sandman Slim, and I wrote a detailed outline of the rest of the book and where the series could go. And I gave that to my agent. And I happened to be at the right place at the right time in the early days of urban fantasy. So HarperCollins, Harper Voyager later, bought the book and said, do 3. And so I knew I could do 3 of this book. I knew I had enough material in my head to tell Stark's story for at least 3 books. And once I did the 3 and they wanted more, I knew that I could do a much larger arc because, of course, writing 3 books, in your head, the story continues to expand. And I knew where I could take Stark over a much longer period of time. That's why book 7, once I finished the first 6 books, book 7 is a reboot in terms of Stark's psychology and the story and the world, because I wanted to start Stark over for the second series of 6.
So that's a lot of thinking and construction and stuff to put together with it. I like that you talk about how that this was sort of like your Hail Mary salvation pass.
Yep.
I've been looking into your background. I mean, you were writing well ahead of this. I saw a note somewhere in a bio, maybe it was on Goodreads or Amazon or something, where it mentioned that you had a story that was turned into the worst movie of 2001 or something like that. There was some kind of note about that.
Something like that around 2001. Yeah, I wrote the first piece of fiction for Wired magazine. They'd never done fiction before. I started as a journalist. So I wrote a piece of fiction about discovering the world's first human clone, but I did it as a news article, straight news. And what was really funny is even though we dated the article something like 2 years in the future, no one noticed that. Everyone thought it was a real article because it was the cover story. So we got huge response to it, and people wanting to interview the little child who was the clone, wanting to interview me. And we had to break their hearts by saying, if you'd look closer, you'd have realized it's all fake. But it was also purchased to be a film, and it went through changes and changes. It was my first real Hollywood experience. It went through changes and changes and changes, and went from basically a hard science, straight ahead news article to the worst parody of a Lifetime movie with Bridget Fonda in the worst hair of the 90s or early 2000s. It was, everything about it was gruesome, and I'm quite delighted to inflict it on friends from time to time.
I wonder how much that experience and the things that followed influenced the world of Sandman Slim, in the sense that, I mean, this is, at least initially, a Los Angeles-based story. You've got a character who's dropping in after 11 years to the land of Hollywood, of moguls and executives and agents and fast-talking, idiots. And not that like Stark in the beginning is, running right into the Hollywood world necessarily, but he's running sort of adjacent to it just by proximity. Did some of that stem from that background that those years beforehand?
Absolutely. Starting with that Wired story, I had a lot of dealings with Hollywood. I talked to a lot of television people and movie people, and it was a really interesting, ridiculous experience. So I wanted to write about that too. That's why the whole thing's set in LA. Los Angeles, really all of California is the American dream. You look at New York is old Europe. The further west you get, you become more what I think of as America, where you lose the Europeanness of the country. And you get into the pure commercialism, dream factory where you can reinvent yourself. That's the way I see the West. And that's what I wanted to write about. I wanted to write, and the most concentrated version of that is Los Angeles, where you have people reinventing themselves to write stories and make movies that are reinventing themselves. It's fantasy within fantasy within fantasy within fantasy. And I loved writing about that. And I still do.
So with LA as the backdrop, and then like you mentioned earlier, you have this sort of like Christian pantheon aspect of the mythology of this story where you've got angels and demons and Lucifer and, a version of God and all of these things. So like, can you kind of walk us through what that looks like in this like world? What is this paranormal backdrop, and what other elements kind of infuse into it and enrich this world?
Well, at first, I knew I was going to deal a lot with hell because Stark spent 11 years there. I knew I was going to deal with the nature of Lucifer. In fact, Lucifer is one of the first things that drew me to the series. I have a whole library of books on Lucifer and evil in the Western world. I'm fascinated by the history of hell and Lucifer. There are some really good books. A History of Hell is a very good book to look at, and so is The Devil, a Biography by Peter Stafford. Those are really good beginning books.
Yeah, I have that one. That was awesome.
I was fascinated because none of these things, like the Bible, can hold a story straight. Story changes from moment to moment, from group to group, from year to year. There is no single story about who the devil is. There's no single story about what hell is. There's a mix of stories for religious and political reasons. And I wanted to write about that as much as LA. So Lucifer was as important to me at the beginning of the series as Stark. That's why, we don't want to give too much away, but Lucifer plays a major role throughout the series, different aspects of him. And I had a lot of fun with that. And I continue to have fun with that because I get to look at heaven, hell, evil, what's considered goodness and salvation in the world. And to a degree, it's really interesting. And to a degree, it's all bullshit. It's like LA. It's like what can you buy yourself into?
Yeah.
Who are the cool kids who get to sit at the big table, and what does luck have to do with it all?
You've got a character like Stark. He spent this time in hell, and hell's a very tangible space. I mean, sometimes when you're talking about these grand ideas, you have the sort of a metaphysical approach to it, or you have what I think of as almost like a Greek mythology kind of approach, where like the underworld is itself a physical place. It operates in a way that we can tangibly like think about and imagine, like, you know, whether it's these arenas and these palaces, there is a physicality to the space that mirrors our own world, but in almost like a fantasy extrapolation of it. Stark is a person who's lived in that space, is essentially the only living boy, like, to go in and come out. And he comes out an altered person. And his best description of it is that he returns very hard to kill. What does that mean for the character? What is the setup and the rules of that particular part of him? And what is his magic, and how does it relate to the real world, the human world?
Well, glad you brought up Greek mythology, because that had a lot of influence on the series, and especially things like the deities, the flawed deities of certainly, Zeus, Hades, and the physicality of the afterlife. Yes, I definitely wanted to play with all that, and definitely I stole all of that structurally from the Greeks. Stark is, I think I can give this away at this point. Stark is a Nephilim. He is the offspring of an angel and a human woman, but he has no idea of this. He has just been able to do little magical tricks his whole life, and he thought everybody could do them. And it took him a while to realize, no, not everybody can do these tricks. And in fact, you're going to get in trouble if you do them, because it makes you different. And so Stark, because of his divine nature, though he doesn't know it, and the significance of what a Nephilim is, how he survived hell, why he survived hell, is very significant to the early books. But yes, Stark has no magical system. Stark is a very chaotic character. The magical people in Los Angeles and in the world, they do have a magical system. The closest thing Stark has to a magical system is one he made up and what he learned in hell. So he can sort of do hellion magic. And that's how he describes it, even though it's his own chaotic, made up on the spot version of it. And like I said, there is, in fact, a magical system that I refuse to talk about for 4 books, because magical systems bore me, and I think they bore readers at a certain point. So when I finally did talk about them, I did it very briskly.
It's an interesting thing to explore in the confines of this show, because every genre of fantasy has its devotees and their own particular kinds of expectations and considerations. And if you get into big time epic fantasy, people want hard systems. They want to know how things work. They want definitive rules. If it's magical realism, they can float around much more whimsically and be like, as long as the story hangs together right, people will roll with it. I think urban fantasy sits kind of somewhere in the middle, particularly because it is often a meeting ground of a lot of different mythological or supernatural or religious or whatever. All those ideas kind of crash together. And so they're all going to operate under sort of their own rules. And I think the average urban fantasy reader just wants a story that is consistent and that it makes sense. But I do wonder, in a case like that, have you run into places where you have established, okay, Stark can do this thing or somebody else can do this thing, and then somewhere down the line you're like, oh, that creates a giant hole for me or a difficulty, or how do I work my way out of this? Anytime that you have characters who have magic, they have loopholes that they can get around things that the average person can't. So, much like the introduction of cell phones screwed up storytelling for writers for a really long time. And once you have a cell phone, there was all kinds of levels of getting lost or being, incommunicado that just kind of disappear in stories. Magic is a similar kind of thing. So, have you run into those problems over this run, and how have you solved them?
The trick I learned is to look at problems as a virtue. When you run into those situations where, Stark's power means he can get out of this, or the nature of Stark's power means he can't get out of this, you have to look at that as an opportunity to do something weird. I mean, that's one of the things that I was determined to do from the very beginning of the series. You see this over and over again in fantasy, if you have a long-running series. A fantasy character's, a protagonist, will gain power over the series. If it's a long-running series, this person can keep gaining power to the point where they're basically God. And I hate that. I hate that idea. So one of the things I've done during the series is take away things from Stark. I am always messing with what his powers are and how he can use them, which makes the world more interesting to me and makes things more complicated for Stark. Anytime he gets too powerful to me, I'll knock him down. I'll take something away. And I really enjoy that. Stark loves cars, but he hates driving the LA freeways. So there were a couple of books where I just put him on the freeway all the damn time. And I think readers like that. I think readers like to see it when you torment your characters, especially someone like Stark, who is powerful. And you pull the rug out from under him and just, say, okay, you can't magic your way out of this. Go take the bus.
Like I noted in the opening introduction, I mean, there's definitely a very strong noir, kind of bloodline running through this. I think that Stark is very classically a noir hero, and both in his sort of attitude, in his view of the world, but like you said, in that fact that like no matter how many times he gets a leg up, he gets beaten back down again. The hardlock hero is a classic trope because it's enjoyable. It gives you that sense of this is a character who is always going to have to be scrappy and struggle. Because like you said, if they get to the point where they're God by the end of it, where's the challenge? Where is story in that anymore?
And you have to have a sense of humor when you're doing that, when you're always messing with your character. That's one of the tricks I learned early in the series is you can cut off as many heads as you want as long as you make it funny. I tried to write Sandman Slim straight when I first started it. I wrote like the first 50 pages without any sense of humor at all. And they were horrible. The things Stark did, if you try to do them as straight narrative without humor, he's just awful. I wouldn't want to read it. But the moment I let Stark be funny and let his voice come out, his dark humor, the dark humor you find among cops, among EMT people, among morgue workers, that dark, weird sense of humor they develop. The moment I did that, Stark came alive, and I think that's why people like him, is that no matter how awful things get, he can see the stupid and amusing side of it.
There's not a lot of room to be stoic when your existence is that much of a mess all the time. Because I think,
exactly.
After a certain point, that kind of character just isn't any fun to be around. And I can't imagine them having any way to mentally process the things that they go through. So him having this framework of a kind of ridiculous inner monologue all of the time, is the only way to survive any of that kinds of stuff. And certainly the things he gets involved with, like I said, I mean, whether you have a companion who's a disembodied head, that won't shut up, or some of the creatures that you run into are absolutely insane. Like there's no way to go through that and walk out the other side a normal, well-adjusted person.
Exactly.
There just isn't any way to go through that. Something I want to think about here too is that with a novel series that's run in the creative process over 10 years, in publication and in writing, and set in our real world, going back and reading the first one and seeing it reflect the era that it is, going through to now, how does that affect your own viewpoint in writing the novel and how you adjust to reflect, a modern sensibility? And I say modern, it's funny, it's only a decade different, but it feels like a really, really long decade that we've gone through. Like, how does that affect your writing process and your world?
Well, Stark has grown, and so have I. There are things Stark says and thinks in those first books that, because of his monstrous qualities, are uncomfortable, and they are uncomfortable for me now. There is, as Stark has evolved, as I have evolved, Stark's language has evolved, and his attitudes have evolved over a long period of time. I think it's what you're getting at, which is the author grows as much as the characters, and that is very true for me. It is very true for Stark. I think the world is a learning process. If you're not a student in the world, you're lost and you're boring. I wanted to do that in my own life, and I wanted to do it for Stark's life. I want him always to be looking for the next thing. I used to know Theodore Sturgeon back in LA a million years ago. And one of his principles of life was ask the next question. And that's what I try to do. And that's what I try to do for Stark is whenever he gets locked into a point of view, ask the next question. What does this mean? Who is this person that I might react to in one way immediately, but that if I look at them a second time, I might see something else? I think his relationship with Kasabian reflects that. I mean, Kasabian is his worst enemy when the series starts. And I think they develop into this somewhat deliberate odd couple relationship where one's Felix and one is Oscar for a long time, or Laurel and Hardy, this relationship between two completely dysfunctional characters who, in a difficult world, end up having to cling to each other for different reasons.
I like that you bring up Kasabian with that, because this is something I think about when I think about long-term fiction series, and in comparison to long-term serial like television, which is that like when you take like long-term television, a lot of character choices and in particular like actors and stuff that end up sticking around or getting bigger roles is an audience reaction. Say take like like a show like Supernatural, where you have a character who's supposed to come in for one arc and ends up being so popular that they end up sticking around through the rest of the show and becomes a fan favorite. Like those things develop kind of organically based on what works. Even if they were never intended, or like a Spike from Buffy, who was supposed to be a one season bad guy, ends up going through the entire series. As a novelist writing something long term like that, did you have characters that you thought would stick around from the, forever from the beginning novels and have that change? Did, the relationships evolve over time in ways that surprised you? Did you ever have that kind of sense of, the fan base really connects with this particular character? Maybe I should explore that more. Like, how did that develop over time?
Yeah, I had several characters do that to me. Candy is the most important one of the bunch. I didn't realize how important Candy was going to become to the series until I wrote the third book. And I realized she is central to everything. Everything in Stark's world in some way goes back to Candy. And there are other characters I didn't know. Brigitte Bardot is someone who I bought in for one book and has stuck around and been a really interesting character. Again, Kasabian I come back to. Lucifer, in the various aspects of him. I try to plot out the books in a general way because they do have that noir, mystery, thriller structure to them. So to a certain degree, I have to know how things are going to happen. But when it comes to relationships and what the characters do, I like to leave holes to let the characters breathe a bit. And that's how certain characters become larger than I originally envisioned them. And so they end up sticking around. And it's not a matter of fan favorites, although people do seem to love Candy. I can't talk. There's a certain sequence of stories that I won't talk about right now. But Candy in Peril freaks out my readers. And so for good and bad, it's Candy's nature, Candy's safety, really anything to do with Candy is fun to work with. Her relationship with Stark, which, like in the regular world, does change over time. She loves Stark and Stark loves her, but long term, all relationships go through changes.
I like her as an example too, because she's a character introduced in the first novel where you could very easily be a one-off background character, could be somebody that, just has that little hint of mystery that keeps you interested, but doesn't necessarily have to develop into more. But very quickly you see that there's a dynamic there that works and is fun on the page. And I can see why fans, I've seen like the fan art and fan reaction to that character. And, that's always going to be really fulfilling as a writer to see the audience connect with a character that much, to care that much. When you know that, like, when you hang that character off the side of the cliff, you're hanging the audience off the cliff as well.
Yes. I got a lot of hate mail after one book.
Oh no.
I got a lot of hate mail. I got a lot of hate mail halfway through one book, I'll say that, because of what I was doing to Candy. And then some people retracted later. But that's when I really realized Candy was central to everything. And I kind of knew it because of her and Stark's relationship, but I didn't know how tied to Candy my readers were. And it's really nice. It's a nice thing to see that I could create someone like Candy and have people enjoy her so much. And I enjoy writing her, and her world is very interesting to me. I actually have plans for a solo story for her because Candy is part of a gang called the Jades. And as much as I try to work in the history of the Jades and the nature of the Jades, it's really hard to sort of stop the flow of a novel and just go, well, here are who the Jades are. So I want to give Candy a little solo outing and really get into the nature of who the Jades are, where they came from, the nature of their powers, because Candy is not human. Candy is a Jade, and the Jades are something I invented that I wanted to be scarier than vampires. You liken vampires to bats. They come in, they bite you, and they fly away. I wanted something worse than a vampire, so I came up with the model of a spider. That Candy bites you, but she doesn't turn you into a jade. There's nothing sexy about it. She just drinks you. You're a human milkshake. She dissolves you the way spiders will do with their prey, dissolves your insides and drink you up. And I wanted to deal with a monster like Stark falling in love with another monster like a jade, and to see how that would work out.
You mentioned there that, like, with the Jades, I mean, that's a whole other big aspect of story that you can introduce, but have a hard time necessarily having the space in the story to explore. I think it's worth noting that these books really move. I mean, once you put the pedal on the gas, they don't really slow down. They are very, very fast-paced novels. Like in Sandman Slim, there aren't chapters. There are scene breaks, essentially. But it gives that sense of like, oh, there's not breathing room. Like Stark does a thing, he might sleep for a night, but then you're right back up and moving, you know? How do you roll out those background things? How do you introduce new characters? How do you build that world while never really letting anybody take a breath for any real length of time? Like, how do you manage that pacing?
Well, that is the trick. And because the books are such a speed rush all the way through, it is fun to stop them occasionally and introduce something, because that creates tension in readers too. When the book is just flying down the freeway at 80 miles an hour, to just suddenly slow down to 30, because people are used to going 80, and go, here's Father Traven. He's a new character, and he's really interesting. Let's take a look at Father Traven. And people want the story to explode again. And you're going, nope, we're just going to look at this guy for a while and see how he fits in. So it's a way to sort of play with your narrative and also torture your readers a little bit. And you're right with the idea of no chapters. I mean, the whole thing is supposed to be Stark. Stark is a wind-up toy that never stops. And that's part of his madness. He won't and he can't ever quite let go or quite let up on the gas pedal. But he has to sometimes, because of characters like Candy, because of Vidocq, his father figure in the series, because of other things. He is forced from time to time to stop and think, and he hates that.
He definitely is like the epitome of can't stop, won't stop. And it makes the people around him miserable because he acts impulsively. And I mean, it's when he's sent to hell, he's like 19. When he returns, he's 30 as a human, but 11 long years in hell age you a lot more than that. And so he has a very kind of grumpy old man kind of attitude to him, but he has the impulsiveness still of a hyperactive 19-year-old.
Exactly.
That combination makes him fascinating because he's bitter and he's angry, but he has no impulse control and is constantly just running straight into madness, like full on head first.
Yes, Stark, as you said, has no impulse control, or he's learned a little bit of impulse control, but not very much. His impulse control, what there is of it, often comes from, again, dealing with the people he cares about. Will this affect them in some way? And when it comes to him, how things will affect him, he tends not to worry that much, because he is hard to kill. He will heal. He will be bruised. He'll be hurt, but he's so used to it at that point. After 11 years of being beaten up in the arena and almost destroyed, pain and fighting and blood are second nature to him. He doesn't think about it. And in some ways, he is someone who is more comfortable there. Later in the books, I deal with the fact Stark is a classic PTSD patient. And he tries to, with the help of some people, deal with the fact that he is essentially a combat veteran who has never come home. And so tries to reimagine himself as something calmer, something more mature, and which works for him sometimes and does not work for him at other times, because when he is trying to be calm, something awful happens somewhere else and he has to react to it. So he doesn't get a lot of downtime.
He definitely has an addiction to conflict, an addiction to chaos. I get the sense early on that he's also a character that, while he doesn't necessarily believe that he deserved all the things that happened to him in hell. He also doesn't perceive himself as a good person who necessarily deserves peace and quiet in any way. Mm-hmm. There's a few moments where he contemplates the idea of like, what would it be like to just say F this and go live a quiet life somewhere? And he can only sort of imagine it in the absolute abstract. There's no way for him to really think that he could have a life like this. I want to talk about structure and how you put this stuff together. But one of the first things that I want to know is that over 11 books, and there's also some ebook like 3.5 kind of, interstitial kinds of things that have come out as well. That's a lot to keep track of. A lot of times when I talk to an author who's, on the third book of a trilogy and I mention the first book and they're like, oh, I don't remember the first book anymore. You'll have to tell me. You'll know it better than I do. How do you keep track of all that? How do you keep the plot threads and the details and consistency across those? What's your method for that?
I have a Bible for the book, just like a television show, in which I try to keep track of who's alive, who's dead, what the relationship is, what came out of some kind of conflict. So I can refer back to that for a lot of material, although, I get kind of sloppy about it sometimes, and I'll go back to look for some information, and it's like, oh, God, I didn't put it in there. So then I have 11 books to go back and look at to try and remember, to try and figure out what this relationship was. And I just sit there like a dummy thinking of keywords that I can search on that will bring me back through all these books to what I was looking for. Like today, even getting ready for this. What is the magic system of this world? I couldn't remember. I know Starks. I knew that there was a 4-point magic system for the Sub Rosa. And the Sub Rosa are the name for the magical people in this book. You have humans and you have Sub Rosa. Sub Rosa have 4 schools of magic, and I couldn't remember them. So I had to go look them up.
Have you found moments where the fan base knows the books better than you do?
I've had a couple of those moments, and it's really embarrassing, yes. But then someone told me that happened to George R.R. Martin, so I feel a little bit better.
I think anything that develops a really strong fan base, you'll eventually find that the fans pour over things in a different way. They don't have to think about the mechanics behind stuff or the years of contemplation and influence that went into something. They just experience the story for what it is. And then they pay attention to all the little details, which can be rough on like long form storytelling, series storytelling, especially like on TV, where they'll spot the inconsistencies that happen because multiple writers and creators have worked on one thing versus something like this, where you're one person having done all of it, but then you have to hold a decade's worth of work in your mind at any given time. And that's gotta be rough.
And they also find significance in things that you necessarily didn't find significance in. You get people coming up to you and like, Stark was eating a cheese sandwich in the third book. And what does the cheese sandwich mean? Well, he was just having a damn cheese sandwich. I couldn't think of anything else for him to eat. He had a cheese sandwich.
There's a very English major problem there. I mean, I remember sitting in literature classes when I was in college, and the teacher is going on and on about the symbolism of this scene and what this thing represents and all this stuff. And I kept sitting there thinking in the room, and I'm like, I think maybe sometimes the writer just wrote an environment. Maybe they put in a couple of things that were important, but they didn't necessarily slave over the incredible thematic imagery or sublime things they were working into. They had a chapter to get done and a next scene to get to. And granted, like, if you think like TV shows or film, production design will often seed a lot of interesting Easter eggs and meaning and things into the background, but those are also made by 1,500 people. As an author, I think sometimes, you have a lot of meaning in your own head, but not necessarily at the time or the bandwidth to try to construct this wild web of meaning around every scene.
Well, in the later books, I try to have things existing on more than one level. The important things. I mean, sometimes it's just a cheese sandwich, but sometimes in the larger story elements and sometimes in the relationships, I do try to have things that exist on more than just the superficial level. You might not notice them. Most readers might not, but every now and then I know that 1 or 2 people will see some weird little thing I put in. And I don't mean Easter eggs. I hate Easter eggs. They just annoy the hell out of me. But some little idea that refers back to something or refers to some obscure bit of mythology, real world mythology. And it delights me when I get like a letter from maybe 2 people who realized, oh my God, you're doing this. I mean, there's a certain amount of Kabbalistic magic and Kabbalistic mysticism in the series. And the people who caught that and understood it were so excited. And I corresponded with a few of them because, the nature of God, I found more in, as I went along, less and less in the Christian canon and some more in the mystical canon of Kabbalism. So, when people discover those little things, it makes me happy, and it makes me happy to find those moments when I can make things more than they are on the page.
So what is your methodology for writing then? In approaching this, you've got big influences to cover, crazy pacing, a world with a lot of different dynamics. What is your drafting style? Are you an outliner? Are you a discovery writer? Are you a combination of the two? How does that work for you?
Very much a combination, but I always start with a strong outline because, again, I need that for the thriller mystery elements. But then I leave holes in it, especially for the relationships. So the holes, I think, keep things interesting for myself. So I could surprise myself. And if I could surprise myself with some little plot hole that I leave or a relationship hole that I leave, I think if I can surprise myself, I can then surprise the reader, which will make them happy. So I outline. The most important part of outlining is remembering that you don't owe the outline anything. I will throw the outline away in a moment if something interesting happens. But I will re-outline from that more interesting point, and then something else will happen and I'll redo the outline. So by the time I finish a book, I'll have 5 or 6 very different outlines. But I always need some kind of skeleton to hang the flesh on that I can look at and go, no, we have to get to this end point because that's what the whole story has been about. The new book, Ballistic Kiss, was the most classic thriller mystery book I've written. And I mean, it was a real old hard-boiled detective book, the most classic of which I've written in years, in which Stark is investigating a murder. And he is essentially the Philip Marlowe, Sam Spade model of someone going through this. At the same time, being a magical person and having weird magical stuff going on around him the whole time. But he can't just use magic to figure out what's going on. Again, it's those limitations. You would think a magician, a powerful magician would go, well, I can just find this guy with a location spell. It doesn't always work that way. And people like to hide things, when you're being investigated, especially if it's an old, he investigates a 40-year-old cold case. Over 40 years, people have been able to hide things really well. So it does become complicated for him as much as the audience. So I outline, I come up with the relationships, but to begin with, I always start with images, scenes, sentences, some little note. I'm working on book 12 now, and I have just figured out one aspect of the villain that I didn't see coming, that he likes little songs. He likes old English beer hall songs, and he sings the worst possible moments. And the idea of that sort of mix of brutality and absurdity really appealed to me. And so I found some old songs. I won't give it away, but some very old, very silly songs that I think will pair very well with gruesome violence.
I like the juxtaposition of those two things. That sounds really fun. Keeping in mind that, especially with Ballistic Kiss being so much more thriller, suspense, mystery kind of structure, did you have a particular plotting method that you were using when you're going into that? Are you sort of going into the outline, sort of, free outlining, or do you have a specific, 3 or 4 act, or like a Save the Cat or a 7-point system? What, anything like that?
I was thinking in terms of 3 acts, and I knew where the story had to start. I knew where it had to end. I always know my beginnings and endings. I don't know why, but I could always see both at the same time. The rest of it becomes a matter of complications. I'm from the old school of what's the worst thing I can do to my protagonist at any given moment? And I work from there. You have the complications of the murder mystery, plus what's something rotten I can do to my main character. And it could be anything from, having him get shot or having to deal with magic, a relationship problem. The reason the new book is called Ballistic Kiss is there is Stark's action aspect of the book all the way throughout. This is a 40-year-old cold case with people who don't want it solved, and there's a lot of violence and there's a lot of backstabbing that goes on. At the same time, it's been 11 books in. Stark has relationships with human beings, and the relationships, both personally and romantically, get very complicated in this book. So I wanted to have both things going on simultaneously. So what's the worst thing that can happen to Stark in terms of his murder mystery? But what's the most complicated, worst thing I can do to him in his romantic life at the same time? And having to have him deal with both his head and his heart really on a level he's never had to deal with before.
Well, I think you set up a really, I mean, at least for me, like a really compelling hook there for Ballistic Kiss. I like that idea of like the cold case, but with supernatural fantasy stuff layered on top of it. That just means that, you know, there are 10 books to read before getting to Ballistic Kiss.
Yes.
Like I said at the top, I think it's a good time for this type of novel because having a little bit of fun, escapism, something that still makes you think, but doesn't necessarily mire you in a difficult real world situation that we're in right now. I think this is a good vehicle for letting your brain breathe and having some fun whilst getting something that's violent and entertaining and crazy and has a surprising amount of depth for something that, you know, is also a good old fashioned beat 'em up. The other 10 novels plus an interstitial or two are available now. On the website, I'll have a full list of all the books and links off to the various ones. I could list them all off, and look at them over my shoulder on my shelf where they're all at. It's a lot of words though, so I'll save it for the actual blog page. But Richard, where should people be following you online to keep up with your stuff and to know when new things are coming from you?
I'm very active on Twitter, so I'm easy to find there. It's just Richard_Kadrey. I'm on Facebook, and I do have a site, richardkadrey.com, that is gruesomely out of date, so I have to do something about that. But Twitter is probably the easiest place to find me. I'm pretty active there.
Awesome. Well, like I said, Ballistic Kiss available now. It's a good time for these things, so people should definitely dive in. Richard, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
This has been episode 10 and the season finale for season 5 of Fictitious. This season was supposed to wrap up earlier in the summer, but as I noted at the beginning of the Martha Wells interview, the last 3 episodes were delayed by an unscheduled hiatus while the world went topsy-turvy. You won't have to wait too long for season 6 though, but I'll be trying something new as Fictitious makes the jump to video interviews on YouTube. If you like the idea of being able to see me and my guests as we ramble on about storytelling, you'll have that option soon. However, I will still be releasing audio-only versions as podcasts as well, so you can get your fix however you prefer. You might hear some production and format changes in the upcoming episodes, but the focus of the show remains the same. As always, you can listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the major podcasting platforms and apps. All the podcast episodes are available on YouTube now as well, and of course, you can listen to and download every episode at fictitiouspodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell all your book-loving friends, all your writer friends, share it on social media, or write a review. All of that supports the authors who appear on the program, and it helps me to grow the podcast. Be sure to follow Fictitious on Twitter and Instagram as FictitiouSPod for updates, discussions, and news about the new YouTube show. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.